Well, good morning. It's so awesome to be here in this lovely church you've got, but it's so weird to be here without anybody here. It's a little strange, and I have to admit, it's a little unnerving. You know, I should feel nervous because of all you, but I feel nervous because I can't see any of you. So I can't see if, a joke's landed or if a joke has completely burned. So we're just going to go with the idea that every joke lands and everything I say is great, and we'll roll with that. Let me introduce you to myself. My name's Eric. I'm a seminary student from Divinity College at McMaster University. I'm married. I have 2 children, and I live in Waterdown. Waterdown's a little community just on top of Hamilton. It's lovely. Right now, I'm a marketing analyst at a multinational marketing firm, and I'm working on that master's on the side at McMaster. But growing up, I grew up in a farming community, much like this community here in Woodstock. Driving up here was kind of cool because it was like driving back through where I grew up. The community I grew up in was a little town called Copetown. For those of you who've been there, you'll know it's the hub of the universe. That's what the Rotary Club sign says, so it must be true. It's a little community kind of packed in between Brantford, Hamilton, and Jerseyville. So if you drive the 403 and you're just about to hit into Ancaster and you see Highway 52, hang a left, and in a few seconds you'll reach Copetown, but don't drive too fast and don't blink because you'll soon be out of Copetown. But Copetown was a great place to grow up. I grew up on an apple farm, so to answer a couple questions, yes, I know how to shoot a rifle. I have been on a tractor. I have seen animals born, and I have spent entire months outside without a shirt on. Not today, thankfully, but that was then. It was unique growing up in a farming community, and it was really difficult as a teenager when we moved into the city. See, Hamilton, for those of you who've been there, is a very different type of place than growing up on a farm. In the farm, there's 2 worlds, really, and most of you probably know this. There's one world of farmers, predominantly white, who have massive groups of tracts of land that they raise crops or animals on. And there's a second world of immigrant workers who come into the farm. And growing up on our farm, it was no different. We had Jamaicans who would come into the orchards, and they would do a lot of the jobs that, to be honest, me and my siblings really didn't want to do. But it was always strange when the season came for the migrant workers to come into the farm, because we would be told, no, you stay away from those people. They were always referred to as those people. And they were always treated as different or strange or even dangerous. And in our farm, they lived in a small trailer back behind the barn, 10 of them, in a trailer probably built for 4 or 5 people. It was a different type of living from what we were used to. Imagine then, when we moved to the city, how hard it was for me to now adjust to going to a high school that wasn't all white kids. There were all kinds of different peoples from all kinds of different countries. And that's the context that I bring with me today as we look into Mark. And today we read from Mark 12, 28 to 31, and I want to reread that for you. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these." Now this is a passage that occurs in Mark, and it's the 5th of 6 different little interactions that Jesus has at the temple. This takes place in Jerusalem during the final week of his ministry. In all of these interactions, we've seen a continuing pattern of the Jewish leaders, scribes, religious leaders coming to Jesus and poking at him, trying to provoke some sort of a controversial response, trying to get some sort of dirt on Jesus per se. And in the middle of this, an expert of the Jewish law interjects with a simple question: which is the most important commandment? Now, what he's referring to is more than 610 different commandments that are contained in the Jewish legal code. Of these commandments, some are seen as heavy and some are seen as light. Think about it like this. If I speed driving home to Hamilton tonight, that's a light crime. I've broken a law, but I'm probably not going to jail, depending on how fast I go. But in the process of speeding, if I wreck and I cause somebody to be seriously hurt, that's a heavy crime that I've committed. Likewise, in the Jewish legal code, there were light commandments and heavy commandments. And in the experts of the law, there was this continual debate over which commandment was the most important. And we're not talking about a debate right then at the time of Jesus' life. This is something that had been going on for centuries. And in this context, this scribe, this teacher of the law, comes to Jesus and says, which one's the most important? And in fact, what he's doing is he's trying to pull Jesus into this debate. Was it a trap question? Was it a genuine what's going on type of thing? We don't really know. It is interesting that as we follow this interaction through to the end, we do see that it is a positive interaction. It's not something that ends up with people leaving in anger or something like that. The scribe seems to be on the right path. So it is possible he was genuinely interested in Jesus' opinion. The first part of Jesus' response to the scribe is something that we're very familiar with. We are to love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. And what Jesus is doing here is something that he quite often does. He's quoting from the Old Testament. Now, today, you and I have the Old Testament, and we have the New Testament to refer to. Then, they just had the Old Testament. And Jesus would refer back to these scriptures quite often. In fact, in this case, he's quoting from Deuteronomy 6:4-5, which was a very well-known verse. This was actually known as something called the Shema, which would have been recited by the most pious Jews in the morning and at night. For the original listeners to this question, which is the most important commandment, this would have been the correct answer. Of course, love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and strength. And it's something that we would probably agree with today. But have you ever wondered, what does that actually mean? I mean, I like to think that I love my family with all of my heart, but do I love them with all of my mind? When my kids are fighting, do I love them with all of my will, with my strength, with my soul? I don't know. It's so hard for me to understand what it means to love in this way. You know, something like loving with all your heart in this represents your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions. The soul is representing our will. The mind obviously is representing what we think, our intelligence, our understanding of what's going on. And our strength, I think, refers to physical actions of what we actually do. And for Jesus to use this all-encompassing phrase to describe how we're to love God, I think is suggesting that what Jesus is really saying is you need to love God all the way. You can't love God part of the way. You've got to love God with everything that you are, with everything that you do. It's kind of like I work in a marketing firm full-time, but sometimes I come and I work for the church part-time. When somebody asks me, what do I do for a living? I say, I'm a marketing analyst. That's what I do full-time. What Jesus is saying is, I want you to love God full-time, 24/7, all the time. It's not easy, and I don't know if it's something we can attain in this lifetime. It's very hard to do, but that's the goal for us. Because loving God like this is a reflection of how he loves us. So how do we do this? And I think Jesus answers that question in the second part of his response to the scribe. Now again, Jesus is going back to the Old Testament and quoting scripture directly. He's quoting from Leviticus 19, which says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." And it's interesting because this whole idea of loving your neighbor as yourself is mentioned 8 different times in the Bible. And when you start seeing stuff appear over and over and over again, that indicates that it's very, very important. For Jesus in this response, what he's trying to show is that those who truly love God the way he had just said was the greatest commandment will reflect that love in the way they treat others. It's a reflection of God's love, but it's also a reflection of our changed and transformed hearts. Now, in the original context, the Jewish listeners would have understood this completely differently than we do. You see, in the original context, they would have known Leviticus 19, and they would have keyed in on do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite. For them, their neighbor was maybe somebody from a different tribe or a different village, but certainly an Israelite. We, like the early Christians, have the advantage of drawing on Jesus' other teachings to discover that a neighbor is not just the person that's like me. We can look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we've all heard many times, to develop a better understanding of who our neighbor is. And it's really, really important for us to start to think about who is our neighbor. When we talk about loving our neighbor as ourselves, that denotes a certain amount of equality. And we can disagree with people for sure. And if anybody's been on social media lately, you'll know disagreeing with people is kind of the thing now. We have to disagree with people because they think differently or do differently. But we are commanded to love them equally because all people are image bearers of God. We need to remember that the love of God extends to all people, and therefore, if we are supposed to reflect that love of God to all people, we need to do that too. So our love can't be constrained, it can't be complicated by internal resentments, biases, hatred, any form of racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia. Any of those type of things is a direct violation of this second most important commandment. But we also have to be really careful that we don't love some people but not others. This is a very dangerous thing. It's important to remember that in the Good Samaritan, this Samaritan that was the whole crux of the story would have been perceived to be subhuman by the original listeners. They would have hated that guy. That was the whole point of the Good Samaritan. If you want to go back to the story of Jonah, remember that Jonah was sent to Nineveh to bring God's message of hope and peace to the entire town. But in those days, the city of Nineveh, Jonah had been taught from birth to hate these people. They were a great threat. And it would almost be like being told to go to your enemy and to show them grace and God's redemption and God's hope. Earlier, I talked about how I struggled with moving from the country into the city. And now, I can look back and I can understand that growing up in a community of people that looked like me, thought like me, and talked like me created certain inherent biases inside of me. As I moved into the city and I became a teenager and went to university, I started to develop sharp edges in my attitudes, in the way I saw other people. When I went to McMaster University the first time, many years ago, McMaster was undergoing a cultural revolution where instead of groups and clubs being given permission to meet but not really permission to advertise, groups and clubs were expanding. So Muslim groups and clubs were starting, and gay and lesbian groups and clubs were starting, and everybody was starting different clubs, which meant that at any given time you could run into a demonstration of some kind on campus. For me at the time, I didn't know it, but I held some of these biases and resentments inside of me, and this caused me to have several interactions that weren't great. Now, at the time, I didn't know Christ. I didn't know better. I was just a kid from the country who thought that everybody should look and sound just like me. Now, looking back, I can understand that at the time, I was several things: homophobic, sexist, xenophobic, and to be perfectly clear, certainly a little bit racist. Thankfully, that was then, and this is now, and Jesus changes us. But the underlying assumption behind Jesus' answer here is that if we love God totally, we need to love these people too. And this idea of love is so important that in Romans 13, 9-10, we read the following: the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are all summed up as one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. You got to understand here what the author in Romans is saying is, if you can just learn to love each other, all the other commandments, they're going to take care of themselves. And if you follow the logic through, it makes sense. If I love my neighbors in my neighborhood, I'm not going to go break into their house when they're away on vacation and steal their TV. They're my friends, I love them. If I love my coworkers at the office, I'm not going to make jokes about them. I'm not going to let other people make jokes about them and make fun of them because they're different from me. This is the goal we need to strive from. But what does it mean if we don't? What does it mean if we don't love our neighbors as commanded? Well, disobedience of any commandment of God is a sin. So simply put, racism is a sin. Sexism is a sin. Xenophobia, homophobia, all of these things are disobeying that commandment to love one another. This is really serious stuff. And too often I think we kind of just, I love my neighbors. I love the Joneses and I love the guy across the street. But we kind of stop there. What Jesus is saying in this passage is very simple. Don't stop there. Keep going. It's very serious stuff. So what does it mean to us today? Well, I think the two commandments we've been given here show the true nature and character of God. We have to start internally and allow God to work inside of us, to spill over into our souls, changing us from the inside out. We can experience that internal change, and when we do, it changes our mind and our actions. What we think and what we do is therefore changed. Well, of course, this begins when we first encounter Jesus and accept him into our lives. But it doesn't stop there. Jesus is continually working on us, refining us, and changing us to be better people. You see, we can't fully love God as commanded in the first commandment until we fully love others. So we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions today. First, we have to ask, do we love God fully? Well, this summer we've been talking all about spiritual disciplines of solitude and how we can use that time to love God more, to develop a better relationship with him. And it's just like working with your spouse or your grandkids or your friends. The more time we spend with those people, the better we get to know them and the more we begin to love them. Likewise, it's with God the same way. The more time we spend in a relationship with God, the more we will learn about him, the more we will experience him in our lives, and the more we will learn to love him. But the second question is more important. It's a question we have to ask ourselves, and we really need to ask ourselves with an open mind. Do we love others as much as we love ourselves? To do this, we need to examine our hearts and look for internal bias, any signs of discrimination or hatred. The reality is, if we look inside ourselves, too often we're going to find what we like. I think I'm doing great. To get a real good feel for what's inside of ourselves, sometimes it's really important to ask somebody else. I have the benefit of being able to go to my wife and asking her. And sometimes that's a really great thing, and other times it's a really bad thing. Both times are the same thing. She usually points out something that I need to work on in my life that I'm not doing right. But sometimes we need to go a little bit further. The office that I work at is located just south of the airport in Toronto, a very diverse office. The last census we did in the office, we found that white guys like me are the minority. It's a great office to work for because we bring all these different world points and viewpoints, and it really develops a strong marketing environment for us. But it also provides a unique opportunity for me as a white Christian to ask questions from my Muslim coworkers, from my Buddhist coworkers, from my gay coworkers. Ask them if I'm on the right page. Last fall, I made a comment to a coworker about how great it is to live and work in the city of Toronto. Now, you got to understand, I know I said I live in Hamilton, in Waterdown, but if you're in the city of Toronto, the boundaries of Toronto start at about Ottawa and end at about Saskatchewan. So that's when I say how great it is to live. It's because in that context, nobody would understand what I would mean. But to be in Toronto, I had commented how great it was because Toronto's this great diverse city. It's a world city, different viewpoints, different demographics, and we don't experience the racism that the Americans face. And sometimes we do that, right? That the Americans face or are dealing with. And we kind of point south as there's the problem. Well, one of my coworkers quickly turned around and she rebuked me. And she explained to me what it was like to grow up in Toronto as a black woman. She told me how she had been pulled over by police simply for driving her dad's expensive new car. The police saw that it was a black person driving and pulled her over. She was racially profiled. She told me how if she ever went into certain high-end stores in Toronto, security would follow her around, even to this day. They would be afraid that she'd be in there to steal. And she told me story after story after story of how racism was real in Toronto. I felt sad and embarrassed, not for the city of Toronto, but for myself. Because in that moment, I realized that my own white privilege that I had hoped I had gotten rid of, all those biases and internal things I thought I'd gotten rid of, were still blinding me to the reality of the community that we live in. Is Toronto any different than Hamilton? No. Is it any different than Burlington or Woodstock or any other community in southwestern Ontario? Not really, because I think if you go and you talk to the people that suffer from racism and discrimination, you'll find that there are stories like this everywhere. You know, without her bravery, I'd still be blinded, and I would think that it was a problem for other people in other places. But what we have to do when we discover a hidden bias or something that's limiting our ability to love others, we need to bring that to God in a state of confession. And we need to seek His help to learn to love people like He does. This is the challenge that every single follower of Jesus faces today. We need to learn to love people like He does. We need to examine our attitudes, our beliefs, our thoughts, and we need to be willing to go into uncomfortable places to learn what God has to speak to us. Obviously, we live in a world torn apart by hatred and discrimination. We can turn on the news any day of the week and we can see protests and we can see this ongoing fight between Black Lives Matters protesters and All Lives Matter protesters and all these fringe groups that are coming out of the woodwork now to protest their standpoint. And they're all missing one thing, which is love. The love of God speaking into their lives. The world is looking for answers, and they're looking to the church. They're looking to us as followers of Jesus to show them a different way. You know, we can stand up and we can say things like Black Lives Matter, or we can push for justice for Indigenous rights, for reconciliation for things that have been done in the past. We can say these things, but as followers of Jesus, we need to demonstrate love by doing things, by showing that love to other people, to people that we might not normally show that love to, because that's the natural response to God's love for us. In the end, we want to be so impacted by our relationship with Jesus Christ that we are compelled to live differently and to show people that love. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for your love for us. We can't understand it, and it just it overwhelms us. It exhausts us to try and come to grips with how much you love us and with what that means in our lives. God, would you help us to love you more? Would you help us just to release our emotions and to embrace our relationship with you? Lord, would you help us to love you in an all-encompassing way? Not just in a partial way, not just in a Sunday way, but in a way that seeps into our lives every day of the week. And in that, Lord, it's our hope that we would love others. Lord, would you forgive us for the times we haven't? For the times we've told a joke that maybe we shouldn't have? For the times that we've muttered something in our breath that we shouldn't have? Or for the times that we were in line somewhere and perhaps we thought something of somebody? Lord, you know our hearts. You know what's in there. Would you forgive us for those times? Would you help us, Lord, to learn to love others as ourselves? Would you help us, Lord, to be that light in our community so that people will look and see, there's something different there. And they would come to us so we could send them to you and we could send them to your Son. Lord, be with us this week. Help us to live changed and differently. Amen.